place that is intimately connected to the sea. Il mare. In Italian. Venice is right up here. And this is their view of the world. Most Venetian maps are situated like this. Because the mainland, for much of Venetian history, is an afterthought. It's the sea. The Adriatic into the Aegean and the Mediterranean. It is an island connected to the mainland via a single bridge that was only built at the end of the 19th century. It's in a lagoon, a very, very shallow lagoon. It's the reason why the city has no walls, never did have walls. If this water was deeper, it would have been vulnerable, but the lagoon itself, in many places, it's only 3 feet, 2 feet deep. So, unless you know where the channels are that have been dredged in the lagoon itself, you can very easily get your boat stuck. This made it impossible for enemies of Venice to approach the city. Inviolable because of this very shallowness of waters. And it was actually prohibited for foreigners to go up into bell towers at low tide because they would be able to see where the channels were that led into the city. It's a city that's bisected by one grand canal and crisscrossed by hundreds of tributary canals. Most streets in Venice aren't streets at all. They're waterways. This is because as an island that is mostly artificially created, land is expensive. Land is difficult to come by. And so streets, as we understand them, are fairly rare. And most of the time, when they do exist, they're very, very narrow. Much of Venice was created by Venetians. They would drive what are called piles, they look like big telephone poles, down into the bedrock to create new quote-unquote land. And so a system of canals is the main thoroughfares, if you will, of the city. And in the middle is the Canal Grande, the big canal, in Italian, essing through the city. It is the major thoroughfare of Venice. Today it's full of water buses, gondolas with tourists in them, but in its heyday, it would have been full of merchant ships coming and going from the Rialto. It's a city that was utterly dependent and thrived because of the sea. And arguably the most important place in Venice is out here on its eastern edge. It's the arsenal. It's where the ships are built. Shipbuilding in Venice is the major industry. The ships that will carry the goods from east to west, will provide the defense of the city, are built here in a 60-acre complex known as the Arsenal.
This is the Arsenal, a temple to military and trading power. Venice's shipbuilding and weapons factory, the engine that ran the Venetian Empire. It occupied the whole easternmost boundary of the city. This place was so important that the whole of Venice kept time according to work hours at the Arsenale. At sunrise every morning, the bell in the Campanile would ring out across the city, and thousands of Venetians would make their way to the Arsenale. The bell is still known as La Malagona, the carpenter, named after the workers who had half an hour to get to the factory. Here, they worked every hour of daylight to ensure Venetian trade routes were never threatened. This place could produce 200 ships in a month. That's 50 ships in a week, 7 per day. It was the first factory production line in the world. All this in the second half of the 15th century, at a time when English carpenters took months just to build one ship.
The Arsenal is a fantastically advanced place. They assembly line these ships. They're not built one at a time. Many are being built simultaneously. It's a very modern place. And they build two types of ships here. On the one hand, there are the warships. The instrument of Venetian power, known as galleys. They are oared ships. They are very, very similar in many ways to a very ancient design of ship that goes all the way back to ancient Greece, the trireme, the three-level ship. Very thin, very fast, very maneuverable. In Venice, one of the worst punishments to be inflicted upon criminals, not execution, it was being sent to the galleys to row in servitude. Many people did not survive their tours of duty on the galleys. And it would be the galleys that would expand the Venetian Empire out through the Mediterranean to many, many bases of operation that allowed Venice to dominate the east-west trade for centuries. The second kind of ship that's built are the merchant ships, known as round ships, not because they actually were round, but because they were wider, they were more rotund, if you will, than the very narrow, sleek galleys. Galleys are the muscle, but it's the round ships that will make Venice the commercial empire that it is. Venetian merchants will dominate the east-west trade all the way up until the 1500s, when a sea route is found around Africa by the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama. We've got a fun article by Robert Davis here from 1997 that talks about the Arsenale and the shipbuilders that work there and their wine ration, which was massive. 500,000 liters of wine a year flow through this fountain that's built in 1636 in the middle of the Arsenale. And it is what it sounds like. It is a fountain that spews out wine. And the workers can take their ration of wine from that. Each worker, depending on the year, some years more, some years less, would get anywhere from 450 to 1,800 liters a year. Now, a wine bottle is 3/4 of a liter, 750 milliliters. So if one person is getting, let's do some math. This will be fun. See how many bottles this is. Somebody get a calculator out. This is not mental math hour. let's say, because that's a big range, let's say 1,000 liters in a year. How many bottles is that? Somebody get this on their calculator. Come on. It's 1,000 divided by 0.75.
1,333.
1,333 bottles. How many days are there in a year? 365. How many bottles a day?
Over 3.5.
Yeah. It's a lot of bottles per day. Yes, sir. The wine bottles? Well, they would be actually carrying away in big jugs. Yeah. Yeah. Now, this wine is not going to be as strong as wine today, which is about 12%. Even so, this is a huge amount of alcohol. You might think this is an irrational thing, an irresponsible thing, even, to have a drunk workforce. But this is a happy workforce. And a happy workforce is a productive workforce. And he talks in this article about this machineless factory versus what to our eyes is an irrational, irresponsible thing to do. But this is a different world, the one that we live in today. And this fountain of wine, these rations for the workers in the Arsenale, cost the Venetian government 2% of its annual state budget. 2%. Doesn't sound like a high percentage, but it is. The arsenal itself swallowed up 10% of the annual budget. And the wine was 1/5 of that. 2%. If you haven't read the article, do read it. It's quite good. Robert Davis is a great historian, and it's a fun topic. So, the arsenal, swallowing up 10% of the state budget, 2,500 workers, a machineless factory, as Robert Davis calls it, allows for an empire to be created. An empire of naval bases stretching across the Mediterranean, with a major trading station in the city of Constantinople. Constantinople, that great east-west gateway, is the end point of the Silk Road, which goes all the way to China, and the entrepot for pepper, for spices, things that you can't get in Europe. The Venetians will become fabulously wealthy as middlemen. The only thing they really produce are ships. Ships to carry the silks, the spices, from east back to Venice, and from Venice to the rest of Europe. They become very resented in the rest of Europe because of this monopoly they hold on trade for centuries, a monopoly that's only broken in the 1500s with the circumnavigation of Africa.
They're producing so many ships every day. How do they get enough crew?
I'm thinking that was a bit of an exaggeration on the part of that. Actually, that was a Venetian nobleman doing a documentary on the city. The crews are prisoners, criminals.
Even for the merchant ships?
Oh, not for the merchant ships. No, those are, at any given point, a large portion of the population of Venice is not in Venice. They're out on those ships. The city, in our time period here, in the 1300s, 1400s, has a population of well over 250,000. By contrast, London has about 10,000 people. It is a massive city, and with a huge population. And it can crew hundreds of ships a year. And the merchant ships have a crew of like 10. Because they're not that big. I mean, they fit in this room. But there's a lot of them. Question. And these merchant ships, when they arrive in Venice, go to two places. They go first to the mouth of the Grand Canal, and then they sail up the Grand Canal to the Rialto. First, they stop at the customs station. Just as if you travel internationally today, you have to go through customs. If you are importing a lot of stuff, you have to pay import taxes, export taxes. Same thing is happening here in Venice, the Dogana, the great customs house. And a large source of Venetian income is import and export taxes. Whereas the rest of Europe is essentially an agricultural economy, where income is produced by land and the produce of land. Venice operates on a very different system. They have no land. They're an island that is jam-packed with buildings. They have to import all their food. And the way they're able to pay for it, in large measure, is through the import and export taxes collected here at the mouth of the Grand Canal, the Dogana. From the Dogana, once you pay up, you travel up the Grand Canal to the Rialto, the great market of the city. Today, there's this very nice 16th century bridge over the canal. This was the most important market in Europe. There were bankers here, traders from all over the world. And quite close to the Rialto were warehouses. Warehouses for all these goods that are coming and going through Venice on their way to the east and on their way to Europe. The main commodities that move to the east are furs, textiles, cloth, and timber. Things that are difficult to find in the Middle East. What comes from the east are luxury goods. Silks. Silk is not produced in Europe until the late Middle Ages. It comes from places like China. Spices, pepper especially. And two of the biggest warehouses are the warehouse, or fondaco in Italian, in Venetian, the warehouse of the Germans, the Tedeschi, Fondaco dei Tedeschi, which is today the post office, and the Fondaco dei Turchi, the warehouse of the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, which is today the Natural History Museum in Venice. But in our time period, these are two of the most important warehouses in this city that exists because of trade. And one of the most famous traders in Venice is Marco Polo. Of course, heard of Marco Polo. Probably learned about him in second grade. He and his father and uncle go all the way to China in the late 13th century. They stay there for years. And when he gets back, he writes a book, creatively called the Book of Ser Marco Polo. Ser is Sir, Mr. Marco Polo. And we've got an excerpt from that book. An excerpt on a city, Kinsay City. And it's an interesting European view of this Chinese empire. He writes that the natives of the city are men of peaceful character. You hear of no feuds or noisy quarrels. There is such a degree of goodwill and neighborly attachment that you would take the people who live in the same street to be all one family. This is a man writing from a particular perspective. Remember that in Siena, in the great the council chamber of the Nine, were all of these emphases on getting along, the fear of factionalism, the fear of violent feuds erupting between families, the stuff that Romeo and Juliet's about, we'll see on Friday. There are 10 principal markets in which the merchants from India and all other foreign parts store their wares. All the 10 marketplaces are encompassed by lofty houses, warehouses, and below these are shops where all sorts of crafts are carried on and all sorts of wares are on sale. This is a merchant who is looking at China through an Italian merchant's eyes. He is struck by the lack of factionalism and by the great markets that are found throughout this city. Today, the city of Kinsei is known as Hangzhou. Not exactly sure where that is in China. My Chinese geography is terrible. But this is an interesting account. It's an interesting source because it tells us not so much about Kinsei City, Hangzhou, but about what a 13th century Italian thinks is important. And what he thinks is important is the prosperity of the markets. This is a very Venetian thing to focus on. And the seeming concordia, harmony that is present in this city. Something that catches his eye immediately. The prosperity and the security. Things that he chooses to write about. Now when he comes back and he writes this book, he's accused of being a liar. What you have seen cannot possibly exist. There cannot be such riches. There cannot be such large cities. But he wasn't lying. Maybe exaggerating here and there. But China in this period is so far in advance of Europe that it's almost comical. So this is the book of Ser Marco Polo in his time in Kinsei. Going back to the old satellite photography. The Dogana and the Rialto. The Dogana and the Rialto. The commercial side of the city. The Arsenale. The factory of war and commerce. But this is the governmental heart of the city. Piazza San Marco. St. Mark, the evangelist, the author of the Gospel of Mark, whose body is brought to the city in the 700s, stolen from Alexandria under the nose of the Muslims, is the governmental center. It is here that the great Church of San Marco is found, the Basilica, a very Eastern, a very Byzantine, if you will, building. Nothing like it exists in the rest of Italy. It is a church that would be more at home in Constantinople. And the reason it would be more at home in Constantinople is that Venetians, throughout much of their history, identify more with Constantinople than with the rest of Italy. And the architecture is proof of that. Building dates from the late 11th century, its domes, and inside with its mosaics. Mosaics that rival those found in the Hagia Sophia. If you ever get a chance to go to Venice, do take some time to go into the Basilica of St. Mark. Nothing else like it exists in the peninsula. And connected to the church, here it is right here, is a remarkable building. It's a U-shaped building. It is the Ducal Palace, the Palazzo Ducale. Venice is a republic, but it has an elected chief executive officer, the Doge, D-O-G-E. It's a Venetian dialect word for duke. He's not a king. He's an executive. He carries out the will of the legislature. The Doge is elected by the legislature. The legislature is made up of the nobility of the city. You have to be born into the legislature. You can't be elected to. Doge serves for life. As we'll see in a moment, has actually little real power. The power lies in the Great Council and the Senate. The Great Council is a massive body, more than 2,000 members. You have to be born into it. Finally, there's the judicial side of the equation. So in this one building, the Palazzo Ducale, you have the Supreme Court, Congress, and the White House all in the same place. And in fact, our government is modeled on the Venetian Republic. The Council of 40, made up of, as you might have guessed, 40 men, ergo its catchy name, is drawn from the Great Council. The Great Council is the really heart of the government. And so this is a republic. A republic, but also a republic of aristocrats, of nobility. The average people do not take part in this government. People who work in the arsenal do not take part in this government. But this form of government will endure until 1797, when Napoleon arrives with his French army. Has a good 1,000-year run. And we model our own government on it.
The Doge's Palace is one of the most extraordinary buildings in the world. There's been a palace on this site from the early 9th century. From here, for almost 1,000 years, the Doge ruled Venice. The present building is a mix of Gothic and Classical, East and West, the marriage of styles that would come to define the look of Venice. The Doge could enjoy a fine palace at a time when other rulers hid themselves away in heavy medieval fortifications. Venice was beginning to exhibit the confidence that came with its miraculous location, impregnable to attack, protected by the lagoon. At the top of the giant staircase in the palace courtyard are the figures of Neptune and Mars, the gods of the sea and war. It seemed as though Venice had tamed them both. This was the ultimate seat of power. The Doge presided over the ruling council here. Laws were made here and justice dispensed. Even the state prison was part of the palace. And at its center, the Doge lived in splendor. This is your Downing Street, Houses of Parliament, Tower of London, and Buckingham Palace rolled into one. Throughout the palace, Venice is represented as a beautiful woman. In painting after painting, she appears with Christ himself. At times, she seems to outshine even the Son of God. The Doge, too, is deified. These images foretell what Venice would become, proud and arrogant. The Doge even appears with the Madonna. This is the great council chamber. Here the Doge presided over meetings with the 2,500 representatives of Venice. This room was at the heart of Venetian government. What we see today is the replacement to an earlier hall, burned down in 1577, but it reflects the confidence of early Venice. At the far end is a huge canvas by Tintoretto, his vision of paradise. A bold assertion that the Venetian government could match the divine order above. Venice tried so hard to banish earthly imperfections that the whole process of electing a Doge turned into a real nightmare.
First, 9 members were chosen by lottery, and these 9 had to choose 40 members of the Great Council. And each of these 40 members had to be approved by at least 7 of the 9. From these 40, they drew lots, and they become 25. And these 25 have to choose another 12. The 12 decided they choose another 45. And from the 45, they arrive to be 11. 11. These 11 were going to choose 41 voters, and they are these 41 that are going to make the election of the Doge. It was that easy. Even us Venetians don't really understand it. But we do understand that it worked.
So the Doge, complicated election procedure. Why would you do something like that, do you suppose? Fear of tyranny. Same thing that is present in Siena. It's present here. They don't want one family to dominate. Afraid of corruption. And so they develop this incredibly elaborate, very confusing election procedure to choose the Doge. Doge then serves for life.
I think so.
So for the times, Venice made immense efforts to avoid the corruption of other states, to stop power falling into the hands of one dynasty.
Every indulgence was granted to the Doge, except he was not allowed to speak to foreigners without supervision. Except every letter he wrote, even to his wife, had to pass before a censor. He could receive gifts, but only flowers, rose water, sweet herbs, and balsam. So he had everything, except his freedom.
The fear of tyranny is so powerful that this elected executive is very powerless in many ways. It's a very important office to hold. Everybody wanted to be Doge. but not because you were powerful, because it was a very prestigious thing to have. It gave great honor to your family. But the power lies in the Great Council and the Senate. In order to be in the Senate, you have to be a member of the Great Council. 300 members of the Senate, 2,600 members in the Great Council. Now, in the rest of Europe, nobility was determined by birth. You controlled land, then you were noble. But Venice is very different. It has no land. And so, nobility is determined by your merchant status. These nobles are all, or once were, merchants, first and foremost. This is a commercial aristocracy, if you will, not one based upon land. But after the year 1297, no new members are permitted to join this commercial aristocracy. There is what's known as la serrata, which is Italian for the closure. The aristocracy is hereby limited to 200 families. They call themselves patricians. It's a Roman term for nobility. And all of these families have commercial roots. So very different from the aristocracies in places like France and in England that are based upon the control of land. 200 families, which provide the 2,600 members of the Great Council and the 300 senators chosen from members of the Great Council. And this is the people that are in charge. And from the Great Council, many, many, many smaller committees are drawn to run the government and to run the city. One of those committees, if you will, runs the judicial side of the equation. Because in the Palazzo Ducale is also the state prison. So you've got Alcatraz, the White House, the Supreme Court, and the Houses of Congress, all in one place, the Palazzo Ducale. And the Council of 40, drawn from the Great Council, is their version of the Supreme Court, consisting of, as you might have guessed, 40 members. The prison is eventually expanded across this side canal here into an annex. And to get from the Palazzo Ducale to the prison annex, you cross this bridge here, known as the Bridge of Sighs, because this is the last view through these windows that prisoners will have of their beloved lagoon. They needed a prison annex because this is, in many ways, a police state. It is a republic, but it is a republic in which citizens are urged to tattle, to report on their fellow citizens. A very 1984 feel to it. All throughout the city are these denunciation boxes where you would write somebody's name and the crime you believe they committed and slide it into the mouth. And this one, in Italian, is the note secrete contro chi occulterà grazie e toffici o colluderà per nascondere la vera rendita di essi, or secret denunciations against those who would hide gifts or offices or would collude to hide the true value of their goods. Corruption. Anti-corruption box here. And there are different boxes for different crimes, spread all throughout the city. And this is why they needed a prison annex, because they were imprisoning lots and lots of people. It's called La Serenissima. This is what they like to call themselves, which means the most serene. La Serenissima Repubblica, the most serene republic, because the government is never overthrown. There's never a coup d'etat for 1,000 years. But this serenity comes at the price of fear. People are afraid. Because once you end up in a Venetian prison, you generally do not leave. So, beneath the serene facade is a kind of sinister underbelly. De notier secrete, secret denunciations. So, what have we learned? Well, we learned that this is a commercial state. The aristocracy is derived from the merchants of the city. Merchants who, when they return to Venice, first stop at La Dogana, the customs house, before making their way up the Grand Canal to the Rialto, to the largest marketplace in Europe, the largest and richest marketplace in Europe. This market is supported by a massive shipbuilding center, a factory before there are factories, the Arsenale, where they can produce hundreds of ships a year. Galleys for war, round ships for trade. Both equally important. One supports the other. If there's no trade, there's no reason for the warships, and if there's no warships, the trade doesn't happen. A symbiotic relationship. And at the heart of the city, the Palazzo Ducale, connected to the Basilica of St. Mark, home of the Doge, the elected chief executive officer of this state, home of the Great Council, home of the Senate, home of the prisons. It's a state that's run by merchants, for merchants. The aristocracy, those 200 patrician families, as they call themselves, are not patricians because of land, but because of their merchant status. It's a very unusual place in many ways. Nothing really else is like it in the rest of Europe. And it's an island. An island that is largely man-made by driving thousands of things that look like telephone poles down into the lagoon, through the mud to the bedrock. An island that is only connected to the mainland in the late 19th century. So, when we come back on Friday, maybe we'll get 50 people here. That would be exciting. We've got a big piece of primary source evidence. Going to have a big discussion using it. Because we're heading down to Florence. We're leaving Venice. We're going all the way down into Tuscany. And this piece of primary source evidence is a ricordanza. It's like a diary, but it's a diary of a merchant. It's his commercial diary, if you will. The man's name is Gregorio Dati. He lives around the turn of the 15th century. And read it before you come to class. Print it off, bring it with you if you're not going to bring a computer, and we're going to have a kind of half lecture, half discussion day with this remarkable source. Nothing like these ricordanzas exist outside of the city of Florence. Florence, as we're going to see, is also a commercial center, but a commercial center of textiles as opposed to the trade that makes up Venice. So, have yourselves a nice day. Oh, question. Friday. Essays will be back on Friday. We'll be in the Dropbox this afternoon.